All right, let's talk about understanding the sources of the Synoptic Gospels. So here again, we've been asking the question, what are the Gospels' relationships to one another? Essentially, with the larger question of this module, how did we get the Gospels that we have? So here, what we want to do is let's talk about the sources of the Gospels. In our last video, we talked about how many feel that Mark was a primary source for both Matthew and Luke. But it goes bigger than that because Mark wasn't the only source for Matthew and Luke. So what I want to do is kind of put a box that represents each of the three Synoptic Gospels right here. And now, if we look at the Gospel of Mark, what we realize and what we learned in our last lesson was that 90% of the Gospel of Mark is found in either Matthew or in Luke's Gospel. This is extremely significant because it very heavily points to Mark being a source for both Matthew and Luke because such a large amount of the Gospel of Mark is found in other Gospels. So this is why many hold to Mark in priority. But the story doesn't end there. Mark isn't the only source for Matthew and Luke because though much of Mark appears in either one of these two other Synoptic Gospels, you can see that there are other sources that they used as well. Now, what's interesting about when we ask what are the sources, we discover that there's a large chunk of the book of Matthew that is not found in the Gospel of Mark, but it is found in the Gospel of Luke. So what does that mean? What that means is there was another common source that Matthew and Luke used that was not Mark, because this stuff is found in both Matthew and Luke, but it's not found in Mark. That means there was another source outside of Mark that they used. And typically this source, we don't know who it was, but it's typically labeled Q. And it just simply means it was an unknown source, but Matthew used it and Luke also used it because they have the same content in both, but it doesn't appear in the Gospel of Mark. So that's known as Q. But if you look at the screen, you can see that there's still some space in Matthew, Mark, and Luke for additional sources. So Matthew must have had a third source, and what M means here is that there was another source that was not Mark and that was not Q that Matthew used, and this is material that is only found in the Gospel of Matthew and doesn't appear in either of the other two Synoptic Gospels. So you can see Matthew right there is a combination of some came from Mark, some came from this other source Q, and some came from an additional third source, again, that we don't know what it is, but it was not found in either of the other two Gospels. Of course, there's still that 10% of Mark that is unique to Mark alone, and the same with Luke. Luke also had a third source that we'll call L, and what that means is it's material that's only found in the Gospel of Luke. It is not found in Mark or in Matthew. So this at least gives us a sense of the fact that these Gospels used multiple sources. However, it's important to know some of the relationships that these sources had to one another because it makes a difference in how we understand the Gospels. Now, we had said in our previous video that the stages of development of the sources were that first you have the events themselves, then you have the oral tradition, then you have the written sources, which is what we're talking about here, and then you have the Gospel accounts, which is the compilation or the organization of the written sources. Along with that, you have four methods of study. Historical Jesus research seeks to understand the first stage, the events themselves. Form criticism seeks to understand the oral tradition. Source criticism wants to understand the source relationship. That's what we've been doing here in this video. And then redaction criticism also talks about how the Gospels, what process the Gospel writers used to edit the sources that they had. We also talked about some of the reasons for Mark and priority. So why do many people feel that Mark is a primary source? We have common material, verbal agreement in order, the order that they appear in, agreement in aside comments, and how they quote the Old Testament. So these, again, are the reasons for many feel that Mark is a primary source document for Matthew and Luke. So that's going to wrap us up on the question of how we got the Gospels, because we talked about the method, we talked about then the relationships to one another, and this now sets us up to begin reading the text itself. And that's what we're going to do in Module 3. So what we want to do as we start our journey into the Gospels is we want to talk about two important sections of the Gospels that set us up for the story. And these are both the prologues and the genealogies. So in Module 3, we are going to enter into the text of the Gospels. We are going to use the harmony of the Gospels as our guide, and we're going to begin to examine both the prologues of the Gospels and the genealogies found in the Gospels, all of that setting the stage for the arrival of Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels. So join me, if you would, in Module 3 for prologues and genealogies.